We've all felt the pinch of higher prices, and every month we get the data. How high is inflation now, and just when is it going to come down? While many of these price hikes are driven by global factors, the rising cost of energy, supply chain issues, some economists are increasingly talking about something else being behind it: greed. The cost of living crisis is not impacting everyone equally. Those at the bottom are struggling to make ends meet, and big businesses are posting bumper profits. So what's going on? Are companies profiteering and hiking up prices just because everyone else is? Sky News has crunched the data on greedflation to find out. I'm Sally Lockwood, with our economics and data editor Ed Conway, and this is the Sky News Daily.
Discourse on inflation in Parliament, in governments and in the Bank of England has been dominated by the need to curb workers' wages.
This is Labour MP Richard Burgon speaking in a House of Commons debate about greedflation in May.
This approach has ignored the elephants in the room, the role that corporations are now playing in driving up inflation through price hikes designed to boost their profits. And there is mounting evidence that such corporate profiteering is playing a very significant role in the latest wave of inflation.
Ed, good to see you.
You too.
So we've had the latest inflation figures which show that we're finally out of double-digit inflation, but that doesn't tell the full story, does it? Explain to us what you made of these figures.
No, that's the weird thing, actually. Kind of when you look beneath that headline number, which definitely looks like good news and is kind of good news. Actually, the rest of the detail was kind of a bit of a shocker. Inflation's not like a level; it's just the rate at which prices changed over the past year. And the main thing that was kind of pushing down that rate was kind of just that the biggest increases in energy prices happened more than a year ago. So that it's just where you are on that kind of spectrum. Inflation just happens to have been not quite as much of a shift, a kind of shift in gear over the past year. It still doesn't change the fact that prices are still going up and that people are paying more and the energy bills are still incredibly high. And even though they're going to come down more this summer, they're still much higher than they were only kind of a couple of years ago. So all of that stuff, in terms of our day-to-day lived experience, is still really, it will still feel like a cost of living crisis. It will still feel like, pretty tough both there and in the shops as well, because food inflation is crazy high. That's nearly 20%. It's come down a tiny bit. Maybe that's plateaued. But, look at food price. We've all seen it, haven't we? Just your daily shop, your weekly shop. You're like, God, is that how much, tomatoes, lettuce, potatoes?
And it's unsustainable, isn't it? I mean, people will not be able to afford. I mean, people already can't afford to make ends meet.
Yeah, on the face of it, it looked like good news. And it's good that kind of the degree of pressure and the acceleration was going down. But actually, beneath the surface, people were looking at that in markets and going, blooming hell, this changes the story for us. And as a result, they went out there and they're making different bets. And now they think the Bank of England is definitely going to raise interest rates at that next meeting. But more importantly, that they're going to put them up to 5.5%. Okay, so 4.5% at the moment, up to 5.5%. And doubly importantly, we all know this, especially if you have a mortgage, the rate that you end up paying on a fixed rate mortgage is not the same as the Bank of England rate, but it is influenced by it, okay? They go out in the market and they're making their own kind of investments and hedges and decisions. That means you end up paying maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, usually a bit more, frankly, than that Bank of England bank rate. That now will change the cost of mortgages. If you are going to refix your mortgage in the coming months, I'm afraid it looks like it's going to be more expensive. And it looks like it's going to be more expensive next year as well.
So it's really interesting you talk about, what we can expect when it comes to interest rates, Ed, because of course that's what the government and the Bank of England have been using, hiking interest rates, but also trying to control wage growth in order to deal with this issue of inflation. But we're increasingly hearing from economists that there might be something else behind it too. This issue of greedflation. Explain what that is.
It's a kind of a terrible term, isn't it? But people like to kind of these made up portmanteau words and things. Greedflation, stagflation, all that stuff. Greedflation, it's kind of a term that economists were talking about a little while ago, mostly actually in the US and in Europe. And they looked at the at the numbers on inflation. They saw they were high. They looked at profit margins, that companies were earning, and they saw those profit margins were getting bigger as well. And they thought to themselves, is this a sign that that many companies are taking advantage of this period of higher prices to raise their prices in order to increase their profits, in order to increase their profit margins? And the European Central Bank put out a really interesting working paper looking at this, breaking down where inflation kind of came from. And you can do that. It's something called the GDP deflator, and you can slice it into a few different parts. And they found actually that was the case in Europe for the last year or so. Profits as opposed to wages, were just about the biggest slice explaining why inflation was going up. So that does look like you've got a statistical explanation for greedflation, as you call it. However, I did the numbers, so I did the same exercise with the UK. And so you can take UK inflation, break it down into profits, break it down into labour, break it down into productivity. And the interesting thing on our end is that actually you do see a bit of that, the kind of the profits effect, the greedflation effect in the very latest quarters. But it's very different to Europe. You don't see as much of that in the last year or so. It does look like this, so far at least, was a massive energy price shock that has then come across and is kind of affecting everyone, whether it's companies or whether it's people. But that being said, it's quite early days. And this stuff is kind of happening now, like businesses are still raising prices. And one of the interesting things about the latest inflation data we talked about is that one of the things that went up is I think mobile phone data charges and phone call charges. And for a lot of those people, a lot of those companies that you're paying your monthly bill to, you might have seen it. They take RPI a lot of the time, sometimes CPI, so retail price index, consumer price index. Those are rates of inflation, and add a couple of % to them. And because inflation is so high, that means those mobile phone bills have gone up a lot. And a big part of the explanation for why inflation was a bit higher than people thought was things like that, was mobile phone charges going up. So is that maybe a sign of more of this to come? I don't know.
Back to our economics and data editor, Ed Conway. Let's talk about food, because that is the thing that I think people are becoming increasingly frustrated at, these soaring prices. Food inflation still at nearly 20%.
Yeah.
Supermarkets also posting bumper profits.
Yeah.
Are they profiteering?
Well, I mean,
what does the data tell you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a definitive answer really, except because part of the difficulty is working out the extent to which those profits were really, really kind of squeezed during the kind of COVID period, which some people make an argument for. You can look at food prices as well. I'm going to give you a slightly economisty answer because I don't think there is a kind of straightforward, clear answer here. When you look at some of the prices in the UK, so food prices, we are quite high in terms of the inflation number right now. So the rate at which it's going up each year. And remember, that's what we're talking about here. Inflation is always about the rate, how fast something is accelerating. It's not about the level of prices. But when you look at the level of prices in the UK and compare it across Europe, actually we're kind of a mid to low table when it comes to our food prices in general. So right now food prices are going up and it's miserable for everyone. And I know this doesn't help to hear it, but they have for many years been quite a lot lower than in most of Europe.
So what you're saying is we don't know yet who, if anyone, is profiteering in the supply chain. We don't know who that may be. And could margins from supermarkets, for instance, could the margins that they're making be adding to the cost of living crisis for people?
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, that's the question. And because we don't know the extent to which these are kind of, in inverted commas, reasonable profits, the extent to which that money is then just distributed through to their workers, or indeed is kept as profits, and indeed the extent to which it's kind of reasonable and is just based on the way that they do their business, it's hard to know how much of it is actual kind of profiteering. What we do know is that there are so many pressures on producers right now. There is such a high level of inflation once upon a time, we kind of had a pretty good handle on what constituted normal levels of inflation. But I think because everything's gone so haywire, because normal inflation is out the window and you've got 20% food inflation and kind of more than 10% inflation for a long period, which is now, thankfully kind of coming to an end, the compass is slightly off beam at the moment. So understanding what is reasonable and what's not has kind of gone. And I'm sure there are kind of examples out there of companies taking advantage. I'm sure there are also examples of companies who are doing very well, not necessarily because they're taking advantage, but because that's just the nature of their business model. I mean, look at some of the energy companies. If you're a company that has a load of wind turbines, the cost of generating electricity has not gone up for you because you've still got the same wind turbines. Maybe you're spending a bit more for fuel on, sending boats out to deal with those wind turbines, or for steel for making new wind turbines and stuff like that. But that's kind of marginal in the scheme of things. You're not paying crazy kind of levels of gas prices. But because in this country, the marginal price for electricity is set by what's going on with the gas market, you've had a period now for a couple of years where if you have wind turbines or indeed hydroelectricity or any of these other things, you can make enormous amounts of money, not because of profiteering, but just because of the nature of the market, which is a little bit weird and dysfunctional. And so it's that kind of thing about that's the problem with the word profiteering, is it kind of implies, people out there on the streets trying to kind of do people over. A lot of these cases, that's not. I mean, I don't discount that there could be some of that going on, because at times like this, who knows? But I think a lot of the kind of companies doing extraordinarily well at the moment, it's kind of just because they're following the business model they have done for some time. They're not driven by greed any more than they normally are, because it's a market and it's a profit-driven market. But it so happens that whether through a regulatory system like electricity, or indeed through the fact that you've got this terrible war going on in Ukraine, prices have gone all over the place. They've done quite well out of it. And the perversity of it is that the rest of us are paying these horrible prices in the supermarket, or for our mortgages, or for our electricity, and all of these things. And you see someone else doing very well at the moment, and it just adds to the depression. It feels unjust.
You've mentioned various sectors that have seen a large increase in profitability: energy, supermarkets, mobile phone companies. Is the government doing anything to investigate this or to regulate it?
A lot of these businesses are kind of regulated businesses. So take water, like massively in the headlines at the moment. How much can the government do there? Well, it can go to Ofwat, the regulator, and say you need to sort things out. It can go to Ofgem when it comes to electricity and power and gas bills, and it can say you need to kind of change the way you're doing things. But those are kind of big seismic changes to the regulatory system, which they're always a bit nervous about doing. So they end up trying to kind of, nudge the regulator and say you need to do a little bit more. I don't see much nudging happening at the moment. I don't see much nudging happening right now. That's the Conservative lodestar, isn't it? Just trying not to intervene. Like you say, it's trying not to intervene as much as possible and letting the market resolve itself. It's often worked pretty well, but I mean, it's just like the question is whether we're in a different world now. Yeah,
you make a good point. It is a Conservative value. But interestingly, we're not hearing much noise from Labour about this either, are we?
No, not yet, no, but a bit more than from the Conservatives. But I think there is an issue that is kind of quite a long-standing issue, which is that in this country over the last kind of decade and a bit, a lot of the profits within the economy as a whole have gone towards capital owners rather than towards workers. Okay, so same thing, if you're breaking down inflation, looking how much is going to workers, how much is going to profits, look across the entire economy at how much of the money we're generating is going to, shareholders' capital versus workers. And that workers' slice has got smaller and smaller over the past few decades, which for a lot of people is another sign of, I call it neoliberalism. There are words for it, but it's a lot of sign for people, workers basically not getting what they think is their fair share, and people who own businesses and own big investments doing very well out of it. Thank you very much. And I think that's the issue: is this kind of an extension of what we've seen in recent years, or is it something else?
And I feel like I always do this to you every time we have a chat, Ed. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel for consumers in all of this bleak news? I
think that, the fact that inflation is no longer in double digits is genuinely good news. Touch wood, but we're past the worst in terms of the rate of increase. The issue, though, Sally, it's the levels that matter. It's the levels of food prices. The kind of upsetting thing about inflation is that it goes up very easily, But often when it goes up crazy amounts, it's not like it kind of afterwards, it comes down to where it was before. And so the question is, how much of that increase is permanent? How much of the time are you going to be looking at a menu in McDonald's and going, oh, well, that's just that from now on, that's the price of a Big Mac. That's the thing. Things get sticky and they stay there. And it's a weird thing. No one knows how to predict this stuff. That's why I'm always nervous about these questions, which are totally reasonable questions. No one knows how to predict. The Bank of England doesn't have. Look at how good stroke terrible a job the Bank of England has done trying to predict inflation. It's been disastrous. So no one knows, and that's partly because it's a psychological phenomenon. How much do these things take hold in people's brains, and they think inflation's here to stay, so I'm going to ask for higher wages, and therefore you're trapped in that situation where it keeps on going higher and higher.
And in light of that, I guess we'll chat again soon, Ed. Thanks so much.
So.
Thank you. My thanks to Ed Conway and to you for listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Sally Lockwood. This episode was produced by Soila Aparicio and Amy Lakin. The editor was Paul Stanworth.